The door to the interrogation room was knocked down and greatly surprised everyone who was in the room. Kento saw the man and was a little scared. It was Director Sota from Fufel University, who used to be one of the strongest warriors of the Ministry of Absorbers. Kazuro was very happy to see the director, and his eyes shone with happiness that a savior had come who would lead him out of this damned place. The minister who was behind the director, Soti, began to apologize for capturing the boy without the director's permission and was very nervous, afraid of the strength of such a powerful warrior. Kazuro began to shout to his savior to quickly free him, since the monster with tobacco smoke had a strong effect on his consciousness. Director Sota was extremely angry that the minister allowed the monster to be used to interrogate the boy, that he destroyed many monsters with his own strength and saved the state, and instead of gratitude he was arrested. The next moment, Director Sota was already near the monster to the smoker, who he grabbed by the neck and began to squeeze, saying that how dare she open her hands to his student. Chief Kento was very scared that old man Sota could destroy his demonic monster with one hand. He became agitated and ordered his monster to return before she died. The smoker's monster began to turn into steam and return to its owner. Director Sota did not continue to try to destroy the monster but left it alone. Director Sota began to teach Head Kento that he should not use monsters during interrogation, as it was illegal. Kento was very scared and did not want to listen to teachings from the old man who was in charge here. Director Sota told Chief Kento that if he wants to vent his anger and use his monsters, then he himself can teach a lesson to a certain chief by showing his hands, which were covered with many seals of monsters. The minister began to stop Director Sota and Head Kento so that they would not start battles in the office, and asks for forgiveness for going too far in their authority. The minister said that he understood everything, and they captured the wrong person, and Kazuro was the hero who saved their city. The handcuffs on Kazuro's hands began to be removed, and he was released from custody. This was very timely, since Kazuro was afraid that the monster would be able to find out everything that the boy was hiding. Kajuro began to whistle, glad that his hands were free again, and Director Sota had come to get him out of trouble. Director Sota draws attention to Kento's dissatisfied face and tells him that maybe they can fight, and then that arrogant and dissatisfied face on the head of Kento will disappear. Kajuro was very pleased that the director humiliated Kento so much, after which Director Sota, along with Kazuro, began to leave the Ministry of Absorbers. Kajuro could not restrain himself and fooled around before leaving, showing that he was not at all afraid of the head of Kento. The minister began to calm Kento down so that he would not continue the fight and would come to his senses. The minister added that if the head continues to resort to interrogations using his monsters, he will be stripped of his rank and demoted. Afterwards, the minister leaves, and the head of Kento was left standing in the interrogation room and clenching his fists in anger that Kajuro managed to leave without any problems. But the head came up with a plan that would lead Kazuro directly to him, using those people who are dear to him. This insidious act fully justifies the character of this person. After being captured in the interrogation room by the head of the absorbers, Director Sota and Kajuro went to a nearby cafe to relax and discuss what was happening. They sat down at a table and ordered drinks. Kajuro, with great desire, began to drink the water that he so wanted, and after being exposed to the tobacco smoke of that monster, he was very thirsty. The old man drank sake and tried to apologize to the boy for getting into such a situation. Suda was glad that the boy was able to save so many residents that it was a trifle to pull Kazuro out of the trap. Kazuro, finishing his glass and a little drunk, was very glad that his mentor helped him so much and saved him from possible problems. While they were sitting and drinking, Director Sota told Kajuro that he wouldn't be able to always save the boy and he had to go away for a while. Kajuro was a little surprised and asked the director what happened. The director began to say that one of his former students was in trouble and some mercenaries were hunting her. Director Sota, lighting a cigarette and enjoying the tobacco, says that it won't take much time and he will be back soon. Kazuro said that the mentor is a true master and cares about his students, even those who no longer study. The director was glad that the boy thought so and patted him on the head for such good words. After which the director lowers his gaze and says that he has several tasks for Kojuro until the director returns from his trip. Director Soda asks Kojuro to become stronger and more independent by trying to act alone and not rely on his teammates. Secondly, sipping a cigarette, the director asks the boy to find a strong monster in order to sign a contract with him and become stronger. Kojuro was a little surprised and asked the director what kind of monster he needed to become stronger. Exhaling cigarette smoke, Director Suda looked terrifying and very seriously said that it must be a demon-level monster with high intelligence. Soda said that a scientist's monster recently appeared in the labyrinth near their school. He is now seriously injured as he fought with a crowd of monsters, but lost his possessions. The scientist's monster had the power to create clones of 4 people. Such a monster has the strength and skills that help it fight many opponents. Director Soda began to say that if you fight this monster scientist, the main thing is to destroy his 3 clones in order to weaken the main one. Kojuro was inspired and determined to have such a powerful monster under his control that he was able to create clones. Director Soda was happy and smiled, holding a cigarette in his teeth, and said that everything is so. If Kojuro copes with such a monster, he will gain control of the strongest monster. Kojuro, after listening to his mentor, remembers that the director spoke about another task that needs to be done. Soda forgot a little and said that the 3rd task would be more difficult. Suda came closer to Kojuro and told him in his ear that he would have to deal with one student who rebelled and went against Principal Suda. Kojuro was a little scared as he recalled that Sarah said that all of Principal Suda's students had great strength and became famous monster scavengers. Principal Soda hands the boy a ring with a skull in the middle and says that this can convince the student to listen to you and listen. After which the guys, after several bottles of alcohol, got up and prepared to leave. Director Soda was slightly drunk and completely forgot about his manners and began to scratch his stomach, feeling that he had too much, while Kojuro tried to understand why the ring was needed. After some time, it became quite dark outside, and it was already late at night. The moon was shining brightly, and the sky was dotted with stars. Kojuro entered the dorm room and opened the door slightly to look around and understand what was happening. Approaching his bed, Kojuro notices that there is a backpack on it. He climbed the stairs and decided to see what the note on the backpack was. It was a note from Han, where he wrote that it was Kozuro's share of the stones that Han collected killed monsters from the battlefield. Kojuro was very glad that his comrades were so strong and kind that they helped him in every possible way in the battle. After which he fell on the bed and fell asleep with great pleasure. The next morning, Kojuro decided to look at the stones that Han left him after the battle. He sits in the lotus position and sits down, opening his backpack, where there were a lot of stones. Kojuro is inspired and decides to use the stones to upgrade his monsters to increase their skills and abilities. The ancient warrior received top-level abilities and became stronger, gaining enough abilities to fight on par with the monster with a chainsaw. The opera singer and actress also received an increase in her skills and discovered a new ability, which makes it possible to heal weak wounds of the owner and monsters that are subordinate. Kojuro was very happy about this progress of his monsters and began to shake his hand with joy. His state was very encouraging and filled him with joyful emotions. Suddenly, a ghoul appears near the joyful Kojuro, who was very unhappy that Kojuro still has not restored the number of dead people, which he promised to do. Near the ghoul stood a monster with a chainsaw, who did not get along with the ghoul and said in every possible way that they did not need such a weak monster as a ghoul in the squad. The ghoul, having heard the words of the monster with the chainsaw, was very irritated and told him to take his words back, otherwise the ghoul would teach him a lesson. The monster with the chainsaw was only too happy to teach the ghoul a lesson that he couldn't do anything without his zombies. He began to flex his fists and answered the ghoul that he would be happy to teach such an upstart and useless old man a lesson. A fight between the monsters began in the room, which greatly amused the busty beauty and the red eye. But the singer and the ancient warrior stood behind and perceived such a brawl as an inappropriate proceeding. Kazuro began to feel that with so many monsters, there would definitely be problems, and it would be necessary to stop the brawl between the two idiots who were fighting among themselves. Kazuro intervenes in the fight and separates two idiots who decided to have a battle in the middle of the room and find out which of them is stronger. After calming his monsters, Kazuro sits in a chair and looks at his phone, reading the news and finding out how the situation in the state is. Kazuro began to think that it would be better for him to recruit monster girls into his squad, since they are calm and can be relied on in everyday matters, such as doing homework. Suddenly, Kazuro comes across an article in the news, which greatly surprised the guy and scared him a little. This event was connected with Konami, as she was going to rob a military convoy. Kazuro thought for a bit and remembered that Hanami said that she could cope with the military convoy herself. But in his heart, he felt that something had gone wrong. Fat Man Po and Han enter the room, who came from lessons, which Kazuro decided not to go to, as he was very tired after being interrogated by the head of the absorbers. Po asked Kazuro if he had done the work that was supposed to evaluate his knowledge for the semester. Kazuro proudly raised a stack of papers and said that everything was done in the best possible way. Behind, the busty beauty and the monster singer were a little tired since they had done all their homework. Po was a little jealous, since his monster was not able to help him with household chores and was generally a trash can, but Kazuro had attractive girls that had many advantages. Kazuro approached the crying Po and began to calm him down, saying that he too could teach his monster to do chores around the house and help with homework. Afterwards, Kazuro decides to thank Han and ask him to give these stones of demonic monsters to his uncle in gratitude for coming to their aid. But Kazuro decided to turn to his comrade with one more request, which looked very suspicious because Kazuro looked very strange. Han was perplexed and very surprised at what Kazuro wanted to ask him. His stony and surprised face indicated that this request could be very unpleasant for Khan. Late in the evening, Kazuro and the ghoul went to a cemetery, near an educational institution where many monsters lived. Kazuro said that now they will begin to increase the number of zombies and restore the ghoul's trust. The ghoul began to look around and thank his master and ask for help in excavating the corpses, so to speak, to unpack the graves. While the ghoul admired the many graves where the corpses of people were buried and rejoiced, Kazuro looked around in search of monsters that should be nearby and keep an eye on their territory. Suddenly, Kazuro notices a weak monster that was hiding behind one of the graves, and the boy was very happy that he had a wonderful idea. Kazuro grabs the monster by the jacket and asks him to gather other monsters and order everyone to help dig up the graves of the people who were buried here. A few minutes later, the monsters came on the boy's orders and began digging up the graves with shovels in order to cope as quickly as possible. The ghoul was very glad that Kazuro had figured out how to quickly dig up the graves. Kazuro took the ghoul's gratitude as an ordinary thing and said that there was no need to thank him like that. The ghoul began to fill the bodies of dead people with his magic. It was magic that made it possible to fill the bodies of the dead with power, which after several processes turned the bodies into zombies. After which the ancient warrior used his weapon to shave the heads of the corpses and hasten their degeneration into zombies. After which the ghoul summoned zombies, who began to be reborn and fully perceived the ghoul as their master and on orders did everything that the ghoul wanted. The ghoul was very happy that Kazuro fulfilled his wish to replenish the supply of corpses, which were very important for the ghoul. Kazuro, hearing how the ghoul rejoiced, leaning against the tree, was a little tense as he participated in a very dubious event where people's corpses are dug up. While the boy was standing behind the ghoul and chewing a twig, a monster approached him from behind, sneaking up unnoticed and greatly frightening the boy. She was a monster of a bride who didn't expect to meet her hubby in such a place at such a time. Kazuro was pretty scared that this girl was pestering him so much. The bride began to hug Kazuro tenderly by his ardent lips and wanted to take the moment to take the boy to her to continue their ardent affairs. But Kazuro didn't want to do what the bride had planned, And thanks to the fact that he doesn't remember anything after their first night, this saved him from the realization that he slept with a monster, and it was his first time. The bride began to hug the boy, not letting him go, and pressed the boy more and more tightly to her sexy body so that the boy would desire her with greater force. Kazuro blushed and tried not to look at the attractive monster, who so wanted to drag the boy into bed. She was getting closer and closer to his lips and wanted to kiss him, to which Kazuro fought with himself and his desire, but realizing that this was a monster, stopped him greatly, and Kazuro asked the bride if she knew where the scientist's monster was now. The bride said that she knew, and Kazuro was delighted and took the bride's hand, trying to take advantage of the moment to find out everything about the monster scientist that was on the bride's territory. Kazuro began to ask the bride to take him to the scientist's monster and continued to hold the hand of the bride, who wanted the boy so much that he could satiate her ardent desires. Meanwhile, the scientist's monster sat in a magical cage and screamed to be released. How dare they even capture and cage the general of the monsters? Suddenly, Kazuro and his bride entered the room, who behaved so timidly and tenderly next to the boy, which raised many questions from the other monsters. The scientist's monster was very surprised because he saw a simple interrupter along with a demonic-level monster of the bride that ruled the local forest. Kazuro smiled and acted as if this was a simple walk for him, in which he felt no fear among the monsters. The scientist's monster was greatly surprised by the command of such a weak absorber at first glance. He lay on the floor very weak and was still sure that such a weakling was no match for him. Kazuro squatted and looked at the monster with the look of a naive boy, which did not cause any fear, and the scientist's monster looked at the boy with contempt. The scientist did not want to talk to the man, who did not look strong and raised many doubts that such a guy was allowed to walk through the territory of monsters. Suddenly, the bride's monster in the blink of an eye approached the cage with the scientist and grabbed him by the neck, which was very strange. The bride began to threaten the scientist so that he chooses words when talking to her fiancé, which has incredible power and is capable of defeating the strongest monsters. Suddenly, Kazuro asks the bride to stop forcing the monster scientist to talk and stop beating him. The bride was pleased that the boy touched her and agreed to unquestioningly fulfill the boy's request. The scientist was very surprised that the boy turned out to be the monster's fiancé, and she claims that the boy has great power. Kazuro invites the scientist to accept his offer and become his absorbed monster in order to fight together in the future. The scientist began to smile and say that the boy would hardly have the strength to tame the monster and become its master. Kazuro began to rise from his knees and brush himself off, since the environment was too dusty and the monsters did not keep it clean enough. After which Kazuro straightened up and, putting his hands in his pockets, told the scientist that he was wrong to think that Kazuro did not have enough strength, since he already had many monsters under his command. The scientist stood up with force and grabbed the bars and began shouting to the boy that he was lying and wanted to deceive the monster in order to try to intimidate him. Kazuro offers to organize a tournament of intellectual competitions, and if he wins, the monster will join Kazuro's monsters, and if he loses, he will leave the monster alone. Kazuro, after thinking for a while, said that he agreed and would try to come up with a worthy problem for such a monster, which has a high level of intelligence. The problem was this. An ancient monk sailed along the river in an old boat that moved along the riverbed without oars, and looked into the distance. The question was, what was the man looking at? The scientist monster began to shout that this was a stupid riddle, and there were too few facts that would not allow him to give the correct answer so easily. Kazuro replied that the riddle was very simple, and the answer was the sun, since the man was looking towards the stream that was going towards sunrise. The scientist was extremely irritated and whispered insults towards the worthless boy. The scientist said that now it was his turn to ask the riddle, and this time he would not lose. Listening to such riddles from the boy, he is sure that he is just a cunning idiot who wants to fool the monster. Kazuro did not resist the words of the monster scientist and agreed that he would ask him a riddle and not worry at all. The monster began to ask a riddle. and was sure that such a guy would definitely not be able to cope with the intellectual skills of a scientist. But for Kajuro, the riddle turns out to be too simple, and he answered quickly and correctly. The monster bride began to hug Kazuro's hand and be glad that she had such a smart husband that he was able to outplay the monster scientist. The scientist's monster was very irritated and angry that some impudent person had humiliated the scientist's monster so much, but did not agree with this and offered to continue the competition. Kajuro clasped his hands and said that he was confident of his victory and would be happy to continue the competition with the scientist in order to finally convince the monster that he would become his minion. Kajuro and the scientist's monster moved closer to each other and began to continue their competition to prove superiority over the loser. After several riddles, the guys began to compete in constructing rhymes, and at one point, the guys began to measure the power of words. But the scientist's monster noticed that Kazuro had done a bad job with the last rhyme and began to mock the guy, after which Kajuro thought about it and decided to answer in the style of a scientist. The father is pressing on the mother, and the mother is pressing on the bed. The bed shakes and presses on the ground, right? The scientist reacted very strongly to what he heard and seemed to vomit his black blood from what he heard. He was extremely disgusted to hear such rhymes. The monster began to shake from the realization of the stupidity of the boy, that he was so frivolous and simple. Kazuro acted as if he had not said anything and whistled as if this was a common thing for him. Kajuro approached the monster scientist and put his hand on his shoulder, saying that now he would obey and begin to serve the guy. The monster could barely stand and had not yet fully come to his senses and grabbed the boy by the jacket, trying to hold on. The scientist's monster comes to his senses from what he has heard and replies that he does not at all agree to accept the offer and become the guy's servant by submitting and becoming his monster. Kajuro rejoiced and looked as if everything had already been decided, and the monster scientist began to realize that he had truly lost in everything. It was as if fireworks began to explode around and burst into applause, as if the boy had won. Suddenly a voice began to appear in the monster's head, which claimed that the scientist's monster was becoming absorbed by the monster of the boy Kazuro, after which Kajuro summons the scientist monster into his hand in order to finally conclude the contract and acquire such a strong monster. On the guy's hand, a fan sign appeared on his right hand, which indicated the emergence of a new strong monster that had great strength and skills. Kajuro was glad that he managed to absorb such a monster without any problems. The monster of the bride hugged the boy again and began to blush because her husband was so strong and cunning, which allowed him to enter into a contract with such a strong monster. After which Kajuro again summons the monster scientist to discuss further plans. The monster, having appeared, began to be indignant and tell Kazuro that he acted very insidiously and not at all as befits a real warrior. Suddenly Kajuro tells the monster that he will help deal with those who drove the monster general out of his post and city. The monster scientist was a little surprised that the boy agreed to help him in such a serious matter. The scientist recalled that he was able to escape only thanks to the self-sacrifice of the monsters that were subordinate to him. They decided to sacrifice themselves to give their master time to escape. Those warriors were captured by other monsters who decided to seize the territory and become its owners, and those who did not want to serve the new master would be destroyed. These monsters were very strong, and they served their ruler, who forced them to go and capture the city where the scientist monster ruled. The scientist recalled those days with great anger and was very upset that the attacking monsters did this to his people. The scientist's monster said thanks for the boy's offer to help free the monster's city and save his fellow monsters from captivity, if they are still alive. Kazuro agreed without the slightest doubt and hit the hand of the monster, who thought that they would just shake hands. But the boy showed another way to express his word of honor. Kajuro hit his chest and said that he would do his best to save all of his monster scientist comrades, since he always takes care of his comrades. Kajuro decides to spend a lot of points to level up the scientist's monster and make it strong enough to help in the upcoming battles with absorbers and monsters. Kazuro was very happy that the scientist's monster became so strong after leveling up that he was inspired by such a powerful monster. Suddenly a bride came up behind her, and in her gentle voice began to tell Kazuro that he was a great fellow and was able to get such a strong monster at his disposal, and now she would like to spend time alone. Kazuro tensed a little. The bride, taking the boy's hand, began to pull it to her chest, saying that it was time to continue their honeymoon and enjoy each other's bodies. Kazuro was very confused and took his hand back, saying in a trembling voice that he still had a lot of unfinished business that could end badly if they were not taken care of. The bride was upset that Kazuro wanted to leave again, but the boy began to calm the bride down, saying that he was worried about her and asked her to hide in a safe place since a war was coming, which could take many lives. Suddenly, the scientist monster intervened in the dialogue between Kazuro and the bride, saying that he knew a suitable place where monsters could hide and escape from destruction and enslavement. The bride began to look at her lover with a look that showed worry and excitement for the guy's life. Kazuro noticed his bride's distress and hugged her by the shoulders, telling her that she shouldn't worry because he could handle everything, and lifted her spirits a little. After which Kazuro left the monster's refuge, and going out onto a high hill, he looked at the lights of the monster's settlement and wanted to save those who treated him so well. After some time, Kazuro returns to the dorm where terrible sounds were heard in the back room, which raised many questions. Kazuro began to approach the place from which the terrible screams of a man could be heard. It was very strange and raised many questions. Kazuro began to look around and try to understand what was happening and why such terrible sounds were heard at such a time. Kazuro orders the Red Eye to use his ability to scan the room and understand what is happening. Red Eye says that he cannot use his power because there is a barrier that blocks all possible abilities. Kazuro realized that he had to resort to another method in order to examine the room and understand what was happening there and why there was such a strong barrier on the doors. Kazuro decides to use the ability of his sword, which is capable of drawing the soul from the owner's body and moving in space. Kazuro flew up to the door, from where terrible sounds were heard and a strange glow was burning, which was very strange and scary. Kazuro was very shocked by what he saw, since he did not expect to see someone who did not in any way arouse suspicion in his behavior. In the room, terrible things happened to a man who was tortured and hurt. He was covered in bloody veins and screamed in pain. The torture was carried out by Sarah, who was a senior student and one of the strongest absorbers of the country's university. She held a brush in her hands, with which she applied strange symbols, which made the guy suffer. Sarah behaved very creepily and caused horror from her appearance and the knowledge that she was capable of such actions. Suddenly, Sarah quickly turns around as if she felt someone's gaze on her, and Kazuro got scared and began to think that he had been noticed. Kazuro's soul instantly began to return to his body and was convinced that everything would work out, and Sarah had not noticed him. Kazuro stood there, turning very pale and nervous, realizing that Sarah was a very cruel person, that she was capable of such things. Suddenly, red eyes began to glow in a dark alley. Sarah began to emerge from the shadows, looking very strange. She began to say strange things and greatly frightened Kazuro, who was horrified, and his soul sank to his feet with fear. Kazuro fell to the ground in fear, and began to scream in fear and cry that his life had not prepared him for such a turn of events. He never expected to have to fight Sarah. Sarah began to look very intimidating and say that she had found him and would do everything possible to make the boy forget about everything. Her eyes glowed red, and it was unlike her. Suddenly, Sarah's tongue elongated greatly, and it looked as if she was a lizard that fed on insects that came within its detection range. The tongue grabbed the boy by the neck and began to choke him a little, so Kazuro didn't even have time to react and dodge the attack. Sarah was not going to kill the boy so easily, and began to drag him into the room where she was torturing one boy. Kazuro tried to resist, and in every possible way free himself from the bonds. Kajuro was already at his limit and began to choke. It became difficult for him to resist, and his eyes began to roll back from the lack of oxygen. Suddenly a fan hits the boy's forehead to bring the guy to his senses and tell him that all this is an illusion. After hearing this, Kazuro opens his eyes and tries to understand what is happening. The scientist's monster intervened in time and awakened the guy's senses so that he would not fall asleep. It turns out that Kajuro stood in the same place near the wall and was absorbed by the magic of illusion, which could make the guy fall asleep. The scientist's monster had great resistance to any effects that affect consciousness and intervened in the boy's fate in time. Kajuro was very worried and could hardly breathe as everything looked very realistic. Red Eye began to apologize, as he was not able to notice in time that what was happening was an illusion. Kazuro gritted his teeth in the realization that he couldn't cope with such an opponent, and Sarah put the curse of illusion on him for a reason. She didn't want to kill him, and maybe she doesn't even know that it was Kazuro. Kajuro began to run up the stairs to escape and shouted that he did not have such strength to cope with one of the strongest absorbers of his university. He remembered that terrifying face of Sarah, who mocked the boy who was screaming and suffering from torture. She looked as if she liked and enjoyed what was happening. Near the boy who was suffering from pain, there was a phone on which there was a dossier on the guy, and a reward was written. A very large sum was assigned for the murder of this guy. The next day, Kajuro and Po were walking down the hallway and talking between couples. Po says that he heard strange news that high-ranking people in the state were increasingly starting to disappear. Kajuro suddenly froze and remembered that Sarah was torturing some man and began to think that all this was Sarah's doing. Suddenly a girl appeared behind her and put her hand on Kazuro's shoulder. The boy seemed frozen in horror that this could be the one who is guilty of what is happening. Kajuro slowly began to turn around and was nervous to see that it was Sarah, who was acting rather welcoming and smiling as if nothing had happened. Sarah began to ask the guys what they were talking about, and Kajuro, as if scared, immediately interrupted Po, causing him to be surprised. Kajuro said that they were talking about the next lesson and how the teacher was very strict, after which Kazuro heard his phone start ringing, and began to think that this was just in time. Now he could move away with dignity and save himself from talking with Sarah. Kajuro grabbed his phone and began to apologize to the guys and say that he needed to talk to Hanami, whom he had not heard from for a long time. Kajuro picked up the phone and started talking cheerfully with Hanami, whom he really missed. Hanami was also glad to hear Kajuro's voice and asked him to meet at a restaurant in one place. It was time for the evening, and Kajuro hurried to the restaurant, where Hanami was already waiting for him, who was going to spend time and discuss many issues. Hanami was not alone and was a little offended by the boy since he managed to be late. She started asking him why he was late. The boy who was sitting next to Hanami began to say that most likely Kajuro was late, since there were many brothels with shop windows nearby, where there are many beautiful girls that beckon with their depraved appearance. Hanami, resting her hand, asked Kajuro if he was really late because of his desire to look at the naked bodies of girls. Kajuro was a little confused and didn't want to admit that he was late because he was trying to get away from Sarah, who was acting strange and suspicious. Kazuro agreed with the boy's words and said that he really froze near the windows with women and began to sit down at the table. Hanami tensed up and was not happy with this behavior, but she understood that Kajuro was just a guy who likes beautiful girls. She reached into her backpack to get something. She took a bag out of her backpack that was filled with stones and put it on the table so that the table shook. Kazuro was very surprised that she managed to steal so many monster stones. Hanami sat with her hands folded and said that she had promised to share the loot from the convoy. She said that she had many new comrades who helped in the battle. Hanami said that she called Kajuro to discuss that recently there was a monster auction, where many powerful demon-level monsters were exhibited that cost a lot of money. One of the clients was very suspicious because he bought a lot of strong monsters and spent more than 1 million stones to get strong monsters under his control. Hanami continued to say that she had found incriminating evidence on that person and something interesting. Her people took very interesting photographs that may influence what is happening. She shows photos of people who have recently disappeared and may be killed. One of the guys is the son of a minister who is in charge of the Ministry of Absorbers. Kajuro, seeing the boy, suddenly remembered that he had already seen this guy. His face turned a little pale, and a cold sweat broke out in horror that his girlfriend was involved in this. Sarah tortured that guy and mocked him in every possible way. Sarah acted as if she enjoyed the boy's suffering and continued to draw signs that caused a lot of pain. The other two were employees of the same agency, which was the opposite of the Ministry of Absorbers. They killed monsters for themselves and sold monsters. Kajuro thought a little while listening to Hanami's story and decided what to do to find out more information and understand what to do with it. Hanami also provided photographs that showed something interesting. She held out some photos for Kajuro to look at. The photo showed that one of the employees began dating the wife of another employee of the monster sales agency. It was very mean of the girl that she decided to cheat on her husband with his colleague. Hanami began to gloat over that woman and say that many girls cheat on their husbands if they stop paying attention to them. Suddenly, Kajuro slams his hand on the table and stands up, forcing the guys to pay attention to him. They were a little surprised and thought that Kajuro had come up with something. Kajuro looked at his hand and began to smile as if he had a very interesting idea. He decided to take advantage of the situation and send photos to a man who was cuckolded by his wife and his workmate. The guys didn't even think about it and agreed with Kajuro that it was a good idea. Comrade Hanami, using the hidden number, is about to send photos, and Hanami simply silently, with a straight face, raises his thumb up. The boy entered all the recipients' information and began sending photos. This was a very interesting decision, and we will have to find out how further events will go. After they sent the photos and indicated the place where the employee's wife would meet with his colleague, Hanami and Kajuro sat on the roof of a nearby building from where they would watch what was happening. Hanami spoke on the phone with her colleague, who obtained information about the employees and their lives. Kazuro sat and expected to see an interesting event, like a drama about how a husband catches his wife cheating on her friend. Kajuro notices a man who looked like the man in the photo and realizes that it is him. Suddenly, he passes the door to the hotel where his wife was and moves in the other direction. This man went into an alley where no one could see him and stood in front of that hotel. Apparently, he was a trained warrior and understood how to get to the right place in a difficult way. This man, like a ninja, begins to climb the building, jumping from side to side. His abilities were amazing and incredible. He climbed up to the floor where the message said his wife would be with another man. He carefully sat down on the parapet and began to peek out the window. He notices how his wife dressed in a beautiful dress and began hugging a man who was his co-worker. His look indicated that he was very surprised that this was really true, and his wife began to cheat on him with his own colleague. Kajuro didn't understand why he looked at what was happening for so long and did not intervene. He was hoping to see a fight or even a murder motivated by jealousy, but here he seemed to enjoy watching what was happening. "Does he really like it?" Kajuro said, to which Hanami was very surprised. The man did not interfere with what was happening and simply jumped to the ground back into the alley. It was very strange. Having gone around the corner, he is going to put on a mask that will hide his identity and give him the opportunity to act without anyone recognizing or identifying him. Kazuro said what he saw and suggested that we need to follow the man, who put on a mask and moved in a completely different direction. Hanami was a little surprised and did not argue with Kajuro. This man looked as if he was planning to do a lot of bad things that could affect the circumstances in the state. Hanami began to think that he just wanted to come home and wait for his wife to come so he could talk to her. Kazuro, with a thoughtful face, said that he strongly doubts it, and it seems that there is something else here. The man began to move quickly and head in the other direction. His actions were completely unexpected and not like someone who saw his wife cheating. Hanami realizes that it won't be easy to keep up with him and decides to use his monster so that they can follow the man. She calls on her ghost, which is capable of flying, and Kajuro and Hanami decide to fly after the man to make sure of what is happening and understand what is happening. The guys sat on the back of the Ghost and began to chase the man who put on a mask and headed along the dark alleys. A few blocks later, the masked man arrived at his destination and jumped onto the balcony of a building where the lights were on. A man, once on the balcony, opens the glass door to enter the room. Kajuro and Hanami watched what was happening the entire time. Kazuro realized that he needed to film what was happening in order to have incriminating evidence and evidence of what was happening. On camera, Kazuro filmed a masked man entering the premises of a high-ranking person who was the Minister of Health. This minister was brutally killed by a masked man who cut his throat. Everything around began to fill with blood as the carotid artery was cut. Hanami was also filming on her phone and began to tense up, seeing that a masked warrior was killing a high-ranking person. This can't just be a coincidence, Hanami thought. Kazuro began to suspect that this man was a murderer, that he was carrying out orders as a mercenary, or that he had decided to kill all those who were somehow connected with his wife. After the murder, the masked man began jumping from house to hide and disappear from view so that no one would notice him, after which he jumped to the ground and calmly began to walk along the road without taking off his mask. Kajuro and Hanami decided not to interfere for now and follow him and find out what happens next. This man was simply terrible and killed quite a few people that night who held important positions in various ministries. These people were brutally killed in such a way that they would only be discovered in the morning. This killer was extremely dangerous and committed many murders in just one night. His cruelty was extremely dangerous for the state. After the incident, the killer decides to throw his mask in the trash to throw away all evidence of the murder, after which the man enters the house where he lives. It was pitch dark all around, but Kajuro and Hanami continued to watch the monster seller, and it turns out to be the killer. The guys sat on the roof of a neighboring house and filmed everything on their phones in order to have evidence or material for blackmail. Kazuro thinks that they need to use the information they received to talk to this man and buy back the necessary monsters from him. Suddenly, after a while, the lights on the upper floors began to turn on in the house, and a girl I knew approached the house. The girl approached the house where the light was on and began to stretch out her finger to use the bell to enter the room. It was the wife of a monster salesman who cheated on her husband with his colleague. She looked very pretty and well-dressed, as if she lived in luxury and had no problems. Kajuro and Hanami decided to take advantage of the opportunity and approach the girl to ask to meet her husband, whom they wanted to meet. The girl didn't even think about the possible problems that two teenagers could cause for her husband and agrees to let the guys visit her beloved. Hanami decided in a whisper to ask Kajuro what they wanted to do and what to talk about with a man who decided to kill many people just to take revenge on his colleague who seduced his wife. The man was already standing in silk pajamas and waiting to meet his wife, who had returned after meeting her friend as she spoke. She approached him and, as if nothing had happened, hugged and kissed her husband, saying that she had been waiting for a long time to meet again and spend time, after which she went to her room to wash off her makeup and go to the shower to get ready for bed. The man stood with a stony face and looked at the guys who came to visit him. He clearly looked unhappy and began to wipe his hand on his cheek, where his wife had kissed him with the shameless lips of a cheater. Suddenly, the man notices that the boy who came to visit began to clap for the man after what he saw. This was a little surprising to the man who had killed many. Kazuro clapped and did not hesitate to say that he was extremely surprised that the man reacted so calmly to the fact that his wife cuckolded him. The man was surprised that the boy was aware of what was happening and began to say that it was none of his business and that everything that happened in his family was his business. Kajuro apologizes for his behavior and has come to talk about buying a monster, which he is very interested in. It doesn't matter to him what price the seller sets, he is ready to pay any price. Kazuro began to behave arrogantly, as if he were from a noble and wealthy family, that he did not know the words of refusal and was always ready to get whatever he wanted. Kojuro decides to say that he is interested in the smoker monster, which has great power, and he really needs. The man turned a little pale, as he had completely different plans for this monster. The man began to refuse the impudent boy and tell him to forget about such a monster, as he was going to give the smoker monster to his son for his coming of age. Kazuro began to tell his new acquaintance to come to his senses, since his son may not be his at all, considering that his wife cheats on him so often. This greatly offended the man, and he barely restrained himself so as not to kill the insolent buyer. The monster seller started telling the boy to stop meddling in his family affairs and get out of his house until he killed him. The man takes a fighting stance to hit the boy and assure him that it will be very painful for him if he stays and continues to invade his family. But Kojuro was a trained warrior and understood what could be expected from a man who killed many important people in one night without even batting an eyelid. Kojuro successfully intercepts the man's blow and says that it is in vain that he decides to end everything with a fight, given that he is most likely telling the truth and that boy is not his son. The man retreated a little and quickly removed his hand, realizing that this was not a simple, arrogant boy, but a worthy warrior who had already fought against strong opponents and was always ready for battle. Hanami decides to intervene and stop the battle, which will lead to nothing good. She asks them to stop and think because they themselves saw the documents and realized that his son is not his own. Kojuro agrees with Hanami and decides to use the trump card he got while spying on the man to get him to give up and give them the smoker monster. Kojuro takes out his phone and reveals that he has a very interesting video that can solve a lot of misunderstandings and questions. It was a video where the murder of a high-ranking person was filmed, which could greatly ruin the life of the monster seller. The seller lowered his gaze, as if he realized that he had been exposed and lost in the fight. He puts his hand on the boy's shoulder and looks up at him. They started smiling and laughing very strangely, as if it was a very awkward situation. The man began to tell the guy that he had won, and the man agreed to give them the smoker's monster. But Kojuro decided to take full advantage of the situation, seeing how the man quickly gave up after seeing the video. Kazuro decides to ask the seller for a few more monsters of high demonic rank, which would not be out of place. But the man was extremely stern and said that he only agreed to one monster, and this video would not be sufficient proof that it was he who killed these people and would not affect his fate at all. Kazuro was a little upset because he understood that this incriminating evidence would only help the colleague with whom the salesman's wife was cheating, and it wouldn't be of much use to the killer himself. Kojuro agrees and says that he agrees to delete the video after he gets the smoker monster. He winked and acted casual and calm. But suddenly, the seller says that he agrees to give away the rest of the monsters if Kojuro agrees to take on one task that he has not been able to figure out for a long time. The guys were very surprised that the man offered them a job for which they could get very strong monsters at their disposal. The monster seller hinted that he needed to collect 2 parts of one medallion, which could change the fate of all mankind. After some time, the guys found themselves in a monster settlement, where there was an old house in the middle of the mountains. Around there were wastelands and trees that had no foliage. Crows and vultures flew in the sky, eager to taste human flesh. In the room of the house there was a wooden box, where the scientist's monster began to help put the smoker's monster so that he could rest after captivity and gain strength. The scientist's monster began to thank Kojuro for helping to free one of the scientist's henchmen. Kojuro was glad that he could help and said that he was still ahead. Kojuro asked his monster scientist to stop thanking him, since he promised to free all the monsters that were under the control of the monster scientist. Hanami was glad that they were able to free the monster, but she was haunted by the task that monster seller offered. Kojuro thought a little, because according to the information of that seller, one person has one part of the medallion, and Kojuro saw this guy somewhere. He kept trying to remember where he saw him. Kojuro thinks they should go back to the university to check on something. He calls the monster scientist back and decides to go to the university building. Kojuro paled a little, as he remembered that one of the people he saw was the man who had that part of the medallion. But that place was very scary, and belonged to a man whom Kazuro had been greatly doubting lately. The guys returned to the corridor, where it was quite gloomy. The windows were open, and the wind blew the curtains on the windows. In the distance there was a door that glowed with a strange green light and hid an eerie place behind it. Hanami got a little scared and began to grab Kajuro's hand and cling to him in fear. Kajuro also felt fear, as he understood that Sister Sarah might punish him for sneaking into her office. Kazuro was nervous and used his red eye to check his surroundings to be prepared for anything and hope that everything would go smoothly and no one would get hurt. Kajuro used his sword to break the chain and break the lock so they could enter Sarah's room. Kajuro and Hanami entered a room where there were many wooden boxes where people were lying. It was so strange, as if they had entered a morgue. Kazuro began to examine the bodies in the wooden boxes to find the person the monster seller was talking about. Hanami felt uncomfortable and disliked the place where she was. Kajuro examined the bodies of the victims and noticed that they were empty inside. It was quite a terrible state, and looked as if the torture would be painful for the rest of my days. Kajuro sees a closed box and wants to open it to check for the right person there. Hanami, a little nervous, suggests summoning a monster that will help in case of danger, and Kajuro agrees. Hanami summoned a monster in bandages so that with the help of his power, he could contain what was inside and prevent it from breaking out. Kajuro prepared to open the box and examine it. Everyone got ready, and Kazuro sharply opens the box and sees there the man he needed. Suddenly he gets up and starts screaming and spitting something strange, as if he was about to vomit. Kajuro and Hanami were very scared and almost shit themselves from fear. Hanami shouts to his monster for the monster with bandages to quickly grab the guy and try to hold him while Kajuro searches his clothes. The monster in bandages wraps the guy in his bandages and forces him to grab his throat so as not to vomit something strange that filled him so much. Kajuro immediately took advantage of the moment and began to search things and the box where the guy who should have part of the medallion was lying. After a few seconds of searching, Kajuro raises his hand with a piece of the medallion and says with delight that he has finally found it. The monster in bandages begins to pull that person back into the box and does not let go until the magical bonds begin to work so that he falls asleep. This person passed out instantly after a veil appeared, the symbols of which covered the entire box. His eyes began to roll back, and his mouth opened and a strange liquid began to come out of it. Kajuro stood over the box and was very surprised that his friend Sarah was doing such cruel things that no one could even think of such a thing. Hanami became scared, and she began to ask Kajuro to quickly leave here. Kajuro notices that not all of the boxes had glowing symbols on their bodies. The last box suddenly began to open, and this greatly frightened the guys. The silhouette of a man began to rise from there, which greatly frightened the guys. They never expected to see in the box a man who decided to spend the night in such a strange place. Kajuro was very frightened and began to tell Hanami that they needed to quickly get away from here while they were still intact. Otherwise, the enemy had great strength and would be able to defeat them. Sarah, who was covered with veins, began to rise from the wooden box and smiled because she saw the guys who decided to visit her, albeit without asking in such a strange place. Sarah quickly stood up and returned to normal. She was completely calm and looked as if nothing abnormal had happened. Kazuro saw Sarah smiling, and his heart began to beat faster with fear that he understood that she could take their lives because they dared to sneak into her laboratory without asking. Kazuro began nervously apologizing to Sarah that they had entered her office without asking, and simply wanted to take one thing they needed from one of her subjects. Hanami quietly asked Sarah why she was lying in the box, to which Sarah replied that she wanted to feel those tortures for herself, what she did on her victims, and smiled. This information greatly shocked the guys, and they realized that in front of them was a completely abnormal person. Only a very strong and crazy warrior could do this, and it turned out to be Sarah. Kazuro showed Sarah the thing that he took from the man's body in the box and asked Sarah to let them go with it since they still had a lot of things to do. But Sarah said that she would not let them go because she had not seen Hanami for a long time and wanted to go to dinner together and chat. The guys experienced great fear being with Sarah, but they had to somehow leave and get on with their task. Hanami began to laugh nervously and ask Sarah to reschedule their wedding for the next time since they still have a lot of things to do, and they are very important and cannot be delayed. Unexpectedly for the guys, Sarah did not stop them and simply accepted the fact that the guys were busy right now. She said that she agreed to reschedule the meeting and wished good luck to the guys, which greatly shocked Kajuro that they were released so easily after what they saw. Kajuro grabs Hanami's hand and begins to run away, shouting after Sarah that they will definitely have dinner together, and they should talk about a lot, to which Sarah stood with her arms crossed and smiled, after which the guys were already on the street and quite far from Sarah's property. They stopped to catch their breath and catch their breath. They were very scared and did not know that everything would end so well. Suddenly, Kajuro pulls his hand towards Hanami's head, which confuses the girl a little and makes her heart beat faster and experience very strange feelings. Kajuro began to straighten her beautiful hair in the wind and smile as if he had always had great feelings for her, which surprised Hanami a little and took him by surprise. But in fact, Kajuro had a different meaning to his actions, and since he had the ability to absorb irritation points and there were many guys nearby who were lonely, Kajuro intercepts Hanami and holds her by the hand and waist, pulling her towards him and begins to say compliments, which made Hanami blush and be afraid that what she sometimes imagined would happen now, thinking about Kajuro. Hanami could not find the words and was very nervous because she did not expect such an ardent attack from Kajuro, who looked very brave, although he had not allowed himself to behave like this with her before. But suddenly Kajuro points his finger at the guys who stood behind and were very angry that he staged a performance in the middle of the street where many students were passing by. Kajuro begins to address the guys and tell them that they are loners and can only dream about a girl in their dreams, periodically locking themselves in the shower for a long time. Hanami guessed that Kajuro could be said to have taken advantage of the situation and did not behave at all nicely. She was angry at the guy who just took advantage of her and didn't even know that she was in love with him. She began to blush with shame that everything had turned out this way and to insult the fool Kajuro in every possible way. She was very offended and stepped aside, experiencing conflicting feelings towards Kajuro. She realized that he just wanted to collect skill points with his ability, and didn't even realize that Hanami was in love with him. After some time, the guys went to a cafe to have a snack and gain strength, and at the same time informed the monster seller that they had gotten part of the medallion. Suddenly, Kajuro throws away his phone, dissatisfied, and says that this seller is completely strange if he thinks that they can find the second part without any evidence or information. Hanami was a little surprised that they bothered to look for the second part. The monster seller was very suspicious, but he didn't say that he needed to find two parts. Kajuro was upset and told Hanami that they had a lot of work to do to find any information about the second part of the medallion. Kajuro pops another bun into his mouth and thinks about where he should go first and how to cope with the upcoming battles with monsters. While the kids were eating and trying to figure out their next steps, Kazuro's phone suddenly started ringing. Kajuro picks up the phone from an unknown caller and asks who it is. He did not at all expect to hear someone important or something that could greatly influence their future fate. He received a call from a girl who was sitting at her table putting on makeup as if she was getting ready for a date. But her words were strange, because she said that she knew where the second part of the medallion was, which the boy needed so much. Her voice was serious and rather insidious, as if she was not an ordinary girl, but someone much more important.